"We can't have you at Thanksgiving, it's just family this year." He said it so casually, like it was nothing more than a line about the weather or the turkey cooking time. I remember the exact way his voice flattened on the word family, as though it was a door he was closing and locking from the inside. My brother, David, stood in my kitchen, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat like he couldn't wait to leave. He had stopped by under the guise of catching up, but the visit had been brief, awkward, and now it was clear why. At first, I thought I'd misheard him. Just family. The words clanged in my head like a loose pan on a rack. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because that was my reflex when something absurd and uncomfortable was dropped in my lap. "Well, that's fine," I said, keeping my voice light. "I guess I'll just have to crash someone else's party." But he didn't laugh. His eyes slid away from mine, focusing on the coffee mug in front of him like it was suddenly fascinating. I could see his thumb rubbing a nervous circle against the ceramic. My stomach tightened. "I mean," he started, "we're just trying to keep it, small this year." Small. That's what people say when they want to shrink you out of their picture. I wanted to ask him what I'd done. Had I offended someone last year? Was this because I'd spoken up when Aunt Linda made that comment about divorce? Or was it about the time I didn't bring the green bean casserole the way Mom used to make it? But I didn't ask. Not yet. The shame was already pricking at me, that hot rush up my neck that made my voice sound thinner than usual. Instead, I just nodded. "Sure. I understand." I didn't. But I knew from experience that asking for clarification rarely got you the truth. People preferred to coat their reasons in vague politeness, as if that made the hurt less sharp. David didn't linger. He downed the rest of his coffee like a chore, mumbled something about traffic, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood there staring at it, the steam from his abandoned mug curling in the air. It's funny how quickly the mind turns against itself. One moment I was angry, the next I was combing through memories, searching for my own faults, as though if I could locate the right one, it would all make sense. Was it the year I forgot to send thank you cards after Christmas? Or the summer barbecue when I left early because I wasn't feeling well, but maybe they thought I was sulking? By the time the kettle started whistling, a sound I didn't even remember setting into motion, I had convinced myself that I was, in fact, the problem. That I'd done something, even unknowingly, that justified my exclusion. I poured the hot water into my teapot, watching the leaves swirl and darken the water, their movements slow and hypnotic. It struck me then how rituals like this, small, solitary ones, had become my anchor points. There was comfort in the predictability, in the way the tea always bloomed the same way, no matter what else in life decided to fall apart. I sat at the table, cradling the cup in both hands, and thought about Thanksgiving at my brother's house. I pictured the long dining table dressed in the familiar cream linen, the candles flickering, the air thick with cinnamon and roasting turkey. I could see everyone in their seats, passing dishes, laughing in that unrestrained way people do when they feel completely at home. And this year, that picture would exist without me in it. My chair, the one I'd sat in for the past 12 years, would be filled by, what? An empty space? Or maybe by someone else. The thought landed in my chest like a stone. I didn't tell anyone right away. Partly because I didn't want to admit it, and partly because I was afraid of what they'd say. Pity would have been unbearable, but so would questions I couldn't answer. My closest friend, Marlene, would have demanded to know why, and I don't know would have sounded too much like weakness. For the rest of that week, I moved through life in a kind of muted daze. At work, I smiled when expected, laughed when someone made a joke, but the sound of my own voice felt distant. Evenings stretched long and silent. I found myself scrolling aimlessly through recipe blogs, reading about pumpkin pie techniques I wouldn't get to test. It was as if I was stuck in a holding pattern, circling the idea of my own rejection without daring to land on it fully. But the thing about holding pain in is that it eventually leaks out in ways you can't control. Mine came on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, when I went to the grocery store. I hadn't planned to buy anything special, just milk, eggs, the usual. But as soon as I walked in, the smell of cinnamon hit me. The aisles were stacked with holiday displays, cranberry sauce in pyramids, box stuffing, bags of pecans. I stopped in front of a tower of sweet potatoes, their skins rough and dirt-speckled, and I thought about the sweet potato casserole I made every year. The one David always said was his favorite. And that's when the tears came. Right there between the sweet potatoes and the bags of marshmallows. They weren't the quiet, dignified kind. They were hot, messy, and unrelenting, and I had to turn my cart down the next aisle before anyone could really see me. By the time I got home, my eyes were swollen and my chest felt hollow. I left the groceries on the counter and sat on the floor in the hallway, my back against the wall. I stayed there a long time, just breathing and trying to slow my thoughts. Eventually, I realized that if I didn't do something, anything, this ache would swallow me whole. So I stood up, grabbed my phone, and called Marlene. When she answered, her voice was bright. "Hey, stranger. How's your weekend?" I hesitated for half a second before telling her. The words felt strange coming out, like I was talking about someone else. "David said I'm not invited to Thanksgiving this year. He said it's just family." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp inhale. "What? Are you serious? That's insane." I shrugged, though she couldn't see it. "Apparently not. What does that even mean, just family?" "You are family. Not this year, I guess." Marlene's tone softened. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry." She stopped herself, as though searching for a word that wasn't cruel. "That's not right." I swallowed hard. "I keep wondering what I did." "You didn't do anything. People make stupid choices for stupid reasons. This is on them, not you." I wanted to believe her. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it had deep roots. After we hung up, I made myself another cup of tea. I sat at the table, watching the steam rise, and thought about the strange kind of loss I was feeling. It wasn't just about missing a meal. It was about the shift in what I thought was unshakable. Family, I'd always believed, was the one place you could count on belonging. But now, that certainty was gone. And the worst part? I still didn't know why. The days leading up to Thanksgiving felt like an odd kind of countdown, not to something anticipated, but to something I dreaded. It was strange, moving toward a day that had always been a given in my life, yet now felt like a wall I was about to run into. Each sunrise brought me closer to it, and I didn't know what would happen after I reached the other side. I thought about calling David again, about asking him directly what he meant by just family. The words replayed in my head until I could almost hear the tone in his voice perfectly, the slight tightness at the edges, the avoidance of my eyes. But every time I imagined dialing his number, I pictured him giving me an answer that would cut deeper than the vagueness already had. I couldn't bear the possibility of hearing something that would leave no room for doubt. So I stayed silent. Instead, I found myself withdrawing from the little things I normally did without thought. I skipped the usual weekly phone call to my cousin Emily. I avoided the break room at work when people started talking about their holiday plans. When the cashier at the corner market asked if I was getting ready for the big meal, I gave a vague smile and said, something like that, before quickly changing the subject. But silence doesn't heal. It just delays. On the Monday before Thanksgiving, I got a text from my sister-in-law, Jenna, David's wife. It was short, almost businesslike. "Hey, just wanted to remind you to drop off the folding chairs sometime this week. David said you still had them from last year." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Those chairs had been mine for years, but when I first moved into this house and finally had space for more than 2 people at the table. I'd brought them to Thanksgiving at David's last year because they were short a few seats, and they'd never been returned. Now, instead of an invitation, I was getting a request to hand them over, like I was a supplier rather than a sister. I typed out 3 different replies before deleting them all. In the end, I just wrote, "I'll bring them by Wednesday." When I dropped them off, I didn't go inside. I told myself it was because I was in a hurry, but really, I didn't want to see the table being set without me. I placed the chairs by the garage and knocked once on the side door. Jenna opened it, her expression polite but distant, as though I was a neighbor returning borrowed tools. "Thanks," she said. I nodded. "Hope you have a good Thanksgiving." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give someone in passing at the grocery store. "Yeah, you too." On the drive home, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. That short exchange told me more than I'd wanted to know. Whatever this was, it wasn't just David's decision. Jenna was part of it too. By Wednesday night, I decided I couldn't just sit at home all day on Thursday, pretending it was any other Thursday. The air in the house already felt too heavy, too still. I needed movement, distraction, anything to keep me from picturing the moment they all sat down without me. So I said yes when Marlene texted that afternoon, "Come over tomorrow. We're doing a misfit Thanksgiving. A few friends, nothing fancy." Her apartment was small, the kind of place where you had to shuffle around each other in the kitchen, but it was warm in the way that only a home with laughter in the walls can be. When I arrived, she greeted me with a hug that lingered just long enough for me to feel the knot in my chest loosen a little. There were 6 of us in total, people I knew only vaguely or not at all, each with their own reason for being there instead of at some family table. A divorced coworker of Marlene's. A neighbor whose parents lived across the country. A man named Ken who had recently lost his wife and didn't want to spend the day alone. It was casual and mismatched. The table was covered with a patchwork of different plates, the turkey was smaller than the one David usually carved, and someone had brought a store-bought pie still in its plastic container. But there was a gentleness to it, an unspoken understanding that everyone there knew what it was to be left out, and no one had to explain. Still, even in that warmth, I caught myself wondering what was happening at David's. Were they laughing at some shared memory? Passing around my sweet potato casserole, or some new version of it, without even mentioning my name? That wondering was like a tiny stone in my shoe, impossible to ignore. After dinner, when the others were talking in the living room, I stepped out onto Marlene's small balcony with a mug of coffee. The air was crisp, the kind that made your breath visible, and the street below was quiet. I thought about how, in years past, I would have been helping clear the table at David's by now, or maybe sitting with a glass of wine, listening to the hum of conversation that felt so rooted in belonging. And then, without meaning to, I pictured them greeting someone at the door, someone who wasn't me. A friend of Jenna's, maybe. Or one of David's coworkers. And in my mind's eye, that person stepped into the warmth of the house, shedding their coat, smiling as they were ushered to the table. My chair. My place. I tightened my grip on the mug until the heat seeped into my palms. It was a dangerous kind of imagining, the kind that fuels itself until you start to believe it must be true. When I got home that night, the house felt colder than it had in the morning. I didn't bother turning on the television. Instead, I went straight to the bedroom and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the day settle over me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I expected. The air smelled faintly of the cinnamon candle I'd left burning last night. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty counter where I usually would have been rolling out pie dough or peeling potatoes. The quiet was thick, but for the first time, I didn't rush to fill it. I brewed tea, the same way I always did, and drank it slowly. It wasn't until midday that curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I was just going for a walk to clear my head, but my feet carried me in the direction of David's neighborhood. The streets were lined with cars, the kind of overfull driveways that only happen when a house is bursting with guests. I slowed as I approached his place, the sound of laughter carrying faintly from inside. The curtains were open. I told myself not to look, but my gaze slid toward the front window anyway. And that's when I saw them, people gathered around the table, the golden light from the chandelier spilling over their faces. I recognized most of them, Aunt Linda, Cousin Emily, even Uncle Mark, who hadn't been there last year. And then my eyes caught on someone I didn't recognize. A woman, seated to David's right, in the very spot where I'd sat for over a decade. She was smiling, leaning in to listen as he said something. Her hand rested casually near his on the table, like she belonged there. The sight was quick, just a few seconds before I forced myself to turn away, but it burned into me. I didn't know who she was, but I knew enough. The walk home felt longer than the walk there. My breath puffed out in short bursts, my heart heavy and unsettled. I didn't know if she was a friend, a coworker, someone new in their circle, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that my place hadn't been left empty. It had been filled, without hesitation. That night, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the hurt had shifted into something else, something steadier, almost like resolve. It was as though seeing that scene had moved me past the fog of confusion and into a sharper clarity. I wasn't imagining the exclusion. It wasn't an accident. And if they had made that choice, then maybe it was time for me to make mine. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke to a quiet that didn't feel like a verdict anymore. It felt like a starting line. The refrigerator hummed, the hallway clock ticked, and the curtains stirred as if the house was breathing without me. I lay still and let the ache move through me. It was still there, but it had changed shape. Yesterday it was a boulder, today it was a smooth stone I could turn in my palm, cool and honest. I got up, put on socks, and decided to do the simplest thing I knew how to do, boil water and make tea. I brewed tea the exact way I always do, kettle on, spoon ready, cup waiting beneath the curl of steam. I warmed my hands around the mug until heat reached my wrists. On the table lay a stack of recipe cards beneath the salt cellar, the ones I've written over the years, stained and softened by use. I slid out the top card and found my own slanted handwriting, sweet potato casserole, and below it a note to myself from some patient past version of me, add orange zest, trust me. I smiled despite everything and tucked the card back. I wasn't ready to decide who would taste that dish again. I only knew I didn't want the flavor of yesterday to keep living in my kitchen. By mid-morning I was cleaning in the way you do when you don't know where else to put your feelings. The junk drawer surrendered its small, stubborn history, 2 corkscrews, 3 batteries of doubtful charge, a key without a door, a tape measure that refused to retract, and birthday candles with all the blue ones missing. I threw away what I could, lined the rest in an old tin, and felt the quiet lightness of empty space. It wasn't joy, it was steadiness, like balancing a plate with both hands. I wiped the baseboards until the cloth came back clean and shook the dust from the curtains. The house did not thank me, but it relaxed. So did I. At the hallway closet I paused. From the back I pulled a wool coat I almost never wore, a stern gray that swallowed light. Jenna helped me choose it years ago on a winter sale day. We'd circled racks while a carol played too loudly, laughing when we had to shout to be heard. The memory tightened something behind my ribs. I put the coat on and looked in the mirror. The sleeves were a touch too long, the fabric was undeniably good. But the person in the glass looked like someone who belonged where I was no longer welcome. I peeled it off, smoothed the shoulders, and set it on the entry table. If a coat can keep a person warm, it shouldn't spend another winter hanging from a hook waiting for the right moment. On the neighborhood app, the downtown shelter had posted a request for warm clothing. I kept going through the closet, scarves I never reached for, boots that pinched, mittens with a thin hole at the thumb, a hat whose scratchy edge always made my forehead itch. I filled a grocery bag, then a second. With a thick black marker I wrote coats and winter things down the side. The ink bled through and dotted the table. I left the dots where they fell. Let them be a tiny constellation that said something in this house had moved from me to someone else who might need it more. I drove the long route by the river, letting the slow winter water steady me. The shelter smelled like coffee, bleach, and laundry soap. A man watched a daytime show from a cracked plastic chair. The woman at the counter, hair clipped up with a pencil, smiled without fuss. "Drop off?" she asked, and I slid the bags toward her. She peeked in and touched the wool coat with a kind of practical gratitude. "These will go fast," she said. "Cold week coming." Her voice wasn't sugary, it was mercifully plain. I nodded and signed the sheet with my name. For one breath, standing there, I felt like a person who contributes to the world instead of waiting to be admitted to it. It was small. It was enough for that moment. On the way home I stopped at a small shop I passed 100 times but never entered, the kind that sells handmade soap, mugs shaped like little moons, and scarves that catch light. I almost left empty-handed, then touched a scarf that felt like the inside of a promise. Deep green. Not loud. The color of moss, of old forests, of anything that endures without demanding attention. I wrapped it around my neck in the warped mirror by the register and saw myself without the severe gray. The difference was small and enormous at once. I bought it. Carrying the paper bag to the car, I felt something lift, a corner of heaviness, a button undone to let me breathe. In the afternoon, I called Marlene and told her about the shelter and the scarf. She listened the way she always does, leaving space where my thoughts could unfold without bumping into hers. Then she said, "Come to the community center with me in the morning. Ceramics open studio. No pressure. You rent a wheel or hand build and talk about nothing important. June runs it, and she's got forearms that could need the moon." I laughed. "I haven't touched clay since high school." "Perfect," she said. "You won't have to unlearn anything. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty." It sounded like an invitation to a life where mistakes are expected and also fixable. That night I slept restlessly, not with dread but with the thrumming kind of alertness that comes before a small journey. Doubts lined up like polite strangers. What if I made a fool of myself at the wheel? What if everyone already knew one another and didn't need me? What if belonging is always a door someone else has to open? They pass through like traffic on the far side of the window. Beginnings make their own courage if you give them a chair. The next morning the studio smelled like wet earth and vinegar. Sunlight fell through high windows onto shelves crowded with bowls whose wonky rims made them beautiful. June at the front desk wore a denim apron powdered with clay and the kind of straightforward smile that never mistakes a person for a problem. She took my crumpled bills, asked whether I had allergies to the soap, and handed me a towel like a promise. Marlene was already at a table, pressing and folding clay with comfortable impatience. "Listen with your palms," she said, pushing a lump toward me. I rolled my eyes and did as told. Under my hands the tiny pockets collapsed, and the mass turned from crumbs to something close to silk. At the wheel I hesitated, and June appeared as if she had been listening for doubt. "Centering is the hard part," she said, settling onto a low stool. "Lean in like you're hugging someone you trust." I leaned. The clay wobbled, steadied, then spun without fighting me. My first piece was a stubby cylinder that flared into an accidental bowl. When I slid a wire beneath it and lifted it away, it kept its shape. I set it on a board, wrote my name on a strip of tape, and felt ridiculous pride bloom. We stayed for hours. Marlene made a mug with a comma of a handle and laughed when it fell off, and she scored and slipped it back on. A man at the next wheel told me he used to play clarinet in a community orchestra until the conductor grew too stern for joy. Now he made vases on Saturdays and filled them with grocery store carnations because beauty doesn't care about pedigree. June moved from person to person like a patient weather system, calming small storms. I wasn't learning a craft so much as practicing a way to be: steady pressure, gentle attention, willing to try again. When we cleaned our tools and stood under the hand dryers, my hands were dry and cracked and I felt oddly well fed. Driving home, I didn't take the river road or the turn near David Street. I drove straight. The direct route felt like a new muscle, unused, a little sore, promising strength if I kept at it. Back in my kitchen I opened my laptop and wrote an email to my brother that I did not send. I told him plain things, that just family landed like a door in my face, that I had seen a stranger sitting in my chair, that love does not excuse cruelty, that silence between siblings isn't neutral, it helps the person who chooses exclusion. I read it twice. It was calm. It didn't beg. I saved it as a draft and closed the computer, my palms still faintly smelling of clay. Sunday afternoon I walked the neighborhood in my new green scarf. The air had that bright, cold honesty that makes every sound clear. At the corner, I ran into Mrs. Patel from 2 houses down, her tiny dog trotting like a mare. We've been promising coffee for 2 years without agreeing on a time. She looked closely at my face and asked, "You are well?" The automatic answer rose and then fell away. "I'm getting there," I said. "Slowly." She nodded as if I'd passed a test. "Slow is good," she said. "Things that grow fast do not root." She tugged the leash. "Come Tuesday. I make parathas. I always make too many." I said I would and meant it. Back home I did something small that felt larger than it looked. I took down the framed photograph in the hallway, the big family Thanksgiving from 3 years ago, all of us crowded behind David's table, my hand on his shoulder, Aunt Linda's chin lifted like she expected a draft, Jenna angled perfectly toward the camera. I set the frame on the dining table and looked at it for a long time. I didn't smash the glass. I didn't turn it face down like a punishment. I watched until it became what it truly was, a moment that had happened, full of people I loved and people who could hurt me, both things true at once. Then I wiped a smudge from the corner and set it on the shelf, not as a shrine, not as a warning, just as a picture. In the late afternoon I baked an apple crisp in a small dish meant for two. Peeling the fruit and cutting away the bruises felt like instruction, salvage what is sound, let heat coax sweetness from what looks plain. While it baked, I washed the sink, folded the dish towel, and set 2 bowls on the table. I ate from one and left the other empty without sadness. The spoon tapped the side of the bowl and the sound located me in my own life. Monday returned me to the lap of ordinary things, emails that don't care about holidays, a meeting that should have been shorter, a paragraph in a report that finally clicked once I cut a sentence I'd been defending out of habit. At lunch I walked to the small park near the office. Children in puffy coats climbed a low wall pretending it was a mountain. A man in a suit made faces at a baby who grabbed his tie, and his posture softened into the shape of someone you would trust to carry a casserole across ice. I sat on a bench and realized I felt present. That evening my phone buzzed with a message from Emily, my cousin. "Hey stranger. How was your Thanksgiving?" The words tightened my throat. I typed and erased, then typed and erased again, then wrote, different than usual. She sent a shrug emoji and, ours was loud. Uncle Mark told the canoe story again. I waited for her to notice I hadn't been there, to ask why. She didn't. Maybe she hadn't looked up from her plate. Maybe the table is big enough to hide a missing person. I didn't push it. The facts sat between us like quiet furniture. As I locked the front door that night, my hand lingered on the deadbolt. I thought about David's voice saying just family and felt some hinge inside me shift by a few quiet degrees. Turning the lock didn't feel like keeping people out, it felt like choosing to be in. This was my floor, my door, my air. The change was tiny and specific, and I could feel it even as the ache remained. The ache rose in strange places, the aisle of sibling holiday cards at the drugstore, the text thread labeled fam sitting silent on my phone like a room with the lights off, the song that shuffled on while I was making eggs and dragged a road trip memory through the kitchen. But there was space around the ache now. A little room for breath and for a small voice that kept repeating without impatience, keep going. On Tuesday I went to Mrs. Patel's. Her kitchen smelled like cumin and butter. She pressed warm bread into my hand before I had my coat off. We sat at her tiny table while the dog rearranged itself on my feet. She asked nothing about my brother. Instead she told me about the new cashier at the market who never has enough change, about her sister in Mumbai who calls at inconvenient hours, about how winter still surprises her despite decades of practice. I ate until warmth reached my ankles and promised to come back with tea. That night I opened the draft to David and changed a comma that had bothered me. I removed a sentence that sounded like a plea. I didn't send it. I didn't need to rush the part where I claimed my voice. It was enough to know it was there, waiting under my cursor, intact. On Wednesday, a week since his visit to my kitchen, I woke before dawn. The street was dark and quiet and belonged to me in a way daytime never does. I made tea and sat at the table with a pen and a single sheet of paper. I wrote, not a letter, not a manifesto, a list of my own making, go back to ceramics, learn a decent pie crust for myself, invite people over on an ordinary Tuesday, take the train to the end of the line just to see what lives there, replace one thing each week that I keep only from habit rather than love, call my mother's old friend and ask for the nut roll recipe, buy flowers for no occasion, wear the green scarf whenever I forget I am allowed to be softer than I feel. As the sky paled at the edges, I stood at the window and touched the cool glass. Somewhere my brother was measuring coffee and folding the newspaper, inhabiting his certainty. I was learning to live inside my questions. For the first time since he said those words, grief loosened its collar. I didn't know what our next conversation would be, or whether there would be one. I only knew this: I could keep moving toward the person I recognized when I caught my reflection in the shop mirror wearing a green scarf that felt like permission. I turned off the kitchen light, locked the door gently, and stepped into the morning. The air met me without judgment. The day didn't require my explanation to begin, and neither did I. The first snow came 2 days later. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind that silences a street or bends branches under its weight. It was thin, almost hesitant, drifting in little spirals before disappearing on the sidewalk. I stood at the window with my tea and watched the flakes touch the hood of my neighbor's car and vanish. There was a time I would have seen that as a metaphor for something, impermanence, maybe, but that morning, it was just snow. Just the world doing what it does, whether I'm paying attention or not. The day stretched quiet. I read a book in patches, the kind where you forget the plot because your mind wanders off to your own thoughts. I paused often, not to check my phone, though I did, compulsively, but to watch the snow change its mind and fall harder. By afternoon, the street was lightly powdered, and the air had the smell of cold iron. That evening, I made a pot of soup. Lentils, carrots, celery, onions. The kind of meal that tastes like a place you can live in for a while. As I chopped the carrots, I caught myself wondering what David was doing. If their dinner was anything special. If the woman who sat in my chair on Thanksgiving had been there before, or if she was new. That thought arrived like a shadow passing over the cutting board, quick but noticeable. I didn't chase it away. I let it pass, and kept slicing. The soup simmered while I folded laundry, the hum of the dryer filling the kitchen like company. I noticed how the simplest acts, matching socks, setting one folded shirt on top of another, were starting to feel like ballast. Something to keep me steady when I might otherwise tip toward bitterness. On Sunday, I went back to the ceramics studio. It wasn't planned, I just woke up and knew I needed to work with my hands again. The clay was colder this time, stubborn at first, but it warmed under pressure. June greeted me with a nod, her hands already deep in a block of stoneware, and Marlene waved from a wheel near the window. I sat down beside her and started centering clay like I'd done it 100 times instead of twice. My bowl came out slightly lopsided, the lip uneven, but I liked it. It felt honest. Keep it, June said when I hesitated about marking it for firing. Not everything needs to be corrected. Her words stayed with me all day. By midweek, I'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost like a life I had chosen: work, small errands, evenings with my own company. The ache of exclusion was still there, but softer now, tucked into the background. It showed up like a dull pressure when I least expected it, a photo of David and Jenna posted by Emily on social media, both of them smiling at what looked like a holiday market, a flyer in my mailbox advertising family game night at the community hall. Each time, the hurt would flare briefly, then settle. One night, I opened the draft email to David again. I read it slowly, as if it belonged to someone else. It was calm, still, but I realized it was written from a place of explaining myself to him, as if I needed him to see my side. That no longer felt true. I closed it without changes. I wasn't ready to delete it, but I could feel myself moving toward a place where I might. On Friday, I met Mrs. Patel again for tea. She'd made cardamom chai, rich and sweet, served in heavy mugs that warmed both hands. We sat at her small kitchen table while the dog dozed between us. She asked me about my week, and I told her about the bowl I'd made, the lopsided one. Good, she said. Life is not straight lines. People who insist on straight lines get lonely. Her words were so simple, yet they landed in me like a seed in good soil. That weekend, I took the train out to the end of the line, just like I'd written on my list. It was a small coastal town I'd never visited, all clapboard houses and gray winter water. The wind was sharp, tugging at my scarf, and the sky had that pearly quality that makes the horizon blur. I walked along the shore, the sand damp and compact under my boots, and listened to the gulls argue over some scrap in the tide line. No one there knew me. No one there cared about family tables or who sat in which chair. It was freeing in a way I hadn't expected. On the way back, I bought a bouquet of carnations from a vendor at the station. Pink, with edges just starting to curl. I put them in the lopsided bowl when I got home, the stems crowding together, and set them on the kitchen counter. It made the room feel alive. In the days that followed, I found myself making small changes without thinking too much about them. I moved the couch to face the window instead of the television. I swapped the heavy curtains for lighter ones I'd stored in the closet. I started keeping fresh fruit in a bowl by the sink, just to see the color. None of it was monumental, but together it shifted the air in the house. And then, one evening, my phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice was unusually tentative. "Hey," she said. "I've been meaning to call. I realized I didn't see you at Thanksgiving." There it was. The thing no one else had said out loud. "No," I replied, my tone even. "I wasn't invited." She was quiet for a moment. "Oh. I didn't know that." "Now you do." There was another pause. "I'm sorry. I should have noticed. It didn't feel right, you not being there." Her words were clumsy but sincere. I appreciated the effort. "It wasn't right," I said. We didn't talk about it much more, drifting instead into lighter topics, her kids, a new job she was considering. But after we hung up, I felt a strange relief. Not because she could fix it, she couldn't, but because the silence had been broken. Someone in that circle had acknowledged my absence. That night, I took the draft email to David and deleted it. Not in a fit of anger, not as a gesture. Just because I didn't need it anymore. Whatever I had to say to him, if I ever did, wouldn't come from that place. In early December, I went to a holiday fair with Marlene. The air smelled like pine and frying dough, and the stalls were lit with strings of warm light. We wandered among handmade ornaments, jars of jam, knitted hats. At one booth, a woman was selling small ceramic dishes painted with delicate lines of gold, each one mended where it had once been broken. "Kintsugi," she explained when I picked one up. "The Japanese art of repairing with gold. It makes the breaks part of the beauty." I ran my fingers over the ridges of gold, thinking about my lopsided bowl, my green scarf, the slow rearrangement of my house. About the places in me that had cracked and how, maybe, they could hold something new without hiding the lines. I bought the dish. Not to use, but to keep as a reminder. The next week brought the first real snowstorm of the season. Heavy flakes, the kind that muffled the world and slowed everything down. I stayed in, baking bread just for the warmth and smell of it, listening to the creak of the house as the wind pressed against it. I thought about the year ahead, about the Tuesdays at Mrs. Patel's, the Saturdays at the ceramic studio, the walks by the river I'd yet to take. I didn't know if David would call before Christmas, or if I'd see Jenna again, or if that woman at the Thanksgiving table would become a regular part of their lives. But the sharpness of that uncertainty had dulled. It was no longer the thing I measured my days against. One night, lying in bed, I realized I hadn't checked their social media in over a week. That small fact felt like proof of something, maybe not healing, but space. Enough space to think about my own life without theirs at the center. And in that space, I could feel something new taking root. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a steadiness I could build on. I didn't need to know where it would lead. For now, It was enough to know I was no longer standing outside a locked door. I was walking my own path, and the snow under my boots was fresh. The week before Christmas, the cold settled in with a kind of permanence. The river had started to skin over in the mornings, a thin glaze of ice forming near the banks. When I walked past it on my lunch breaks, I could see how the frost clung to the dead reeds, silvering them like fine hair. It was the time of year when everything seemed to retreat, not just plants and animals, but people too. The streets were quieter, voices muffled behind scarves, and lights glowed behind drawn curtains. I'd expected to feel lonelier during the holidays. Maybe a month ago, I would have. But now, my days were filling with small plans that didn't revolve around David or Jenna or their table. Marlene had invited me to a winter solstice gathering at her friend's place. Mrs. Patel had pressed a bag of spiced almonds into my hand just because. The ceramics studio was hosting an open house where people could display their work, and though I wasn't sure my bowls were worthy of a table, June insisted. Imperfection is an invitation, she told me. On the Saturday before Christmas, I spent the morning baking. Not for anyone in particular, just because the house smelled better when the oven was warm. I made nut roll from the recipe I'd finally called my mother's old friend to get. It wasn't perfect, the dough rose unevenly, the filling leaked in spots, but the taste was close enough to the memory. I sliced one roll in half, wrapped it in wax paper, and decided to bring it to the open house. The studio was buzzing when I arrived. Tables were covered with pieces in every stage of finish: vases, mugs, plates with uneven rims, small sculptures. My lopsided bowl sat on the end of a table, holding my pink carnations that were now beginning to wilt. People wandered, holding cups of cider, chatting about glaze colors and kiln temperatures. A man in a green wool cap stopped at my bowl. "I like this," he said. "It's not trying to be anything but what it is." I smiled. "That's good, because I don't think I could make it symmetrical if I tried." He laughed. "Symmetry's overrated. My wife's a gardener, says the same thing about plants." We talked for a while, nothing heavy, just easy words between strangers. When he moved on, I realized I hadn't thought about David or Thanksgiving in hours. It startled me a little, the way absence could shrink without warning. That evening, back home, I set the half-nut roll I'd saved on the counter. I considered bringing it to Mrs. Patel, but it was late, and the street was icy. Instead, I made myself tea and cut 2 slices, eating them slowly, as if stretching the taste could stretch the moment. The days leading to Christmas moved quickly. I went to the solstice gathering with Marlene, where we stood around a backyard fire pit, our breath mingling with the smoke, and people wrote down things they wanted to release before the year ended. I wrote explaining myself to people who don't want to understand and folded the paper twice before tossing it into the flames. The smoke caught in my scarf, clinging there even after I got home. On Christmas Eve, I stayed in. I lit candles, turned on the radio, and made soup again, the same lentil and carrot kind. Outside, the snow fell in a steady curtain. I could see the faint glow of Christmas lights from the houses across the street. I didn't feel the need to peek at David's house on social media or imagine their table. Instead, I imagined my own table, small but mine, with room for whoever might sit there next year. Christmas morning, I took a walk through the neighborhood. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when most people are indoors, opening gifts or making breakfast. I passed Mrs. Patel's, saw her through the window, rolling dough on her counter, the dog at her feet. I thought about knocking but didn't, the sight of her busy in her own life was enough. That afternoon, I called my cousin Emily to wish her Merry Christmas. She sounded relaxed, happier than she had on our last call. She didn't bring up Thanksgiving, and I didn't either. We talked about small things, the weather, her kids' gifts, a book she'd just finished. When we hung up, I realized I didn't feel that old pang of loss. Our conversation was what it was, without the weight of what it wasn't. In the quiet days between Christmas and New Year's, I cleaned out the last of the closet clutter. The empty spaces pleased me more than I expected. I bought myself a small plant, a pothose with trailing vines, and put it on the kitchen shelf where the light lingered in the afternoons. Every time I walked past, I touched one leaf, just to feel the waxy coolness. New Year's Eve, Marlene and I went to a small gathering at a friend's apartment. There were no countdowns or confetti, just music and food and people talking in clusters. At midnight, we clinked glasses of sparkling cider and wished each other a better year. I didn't make resolutions. Instead, I thought about the list I'd written that morning at the kitchen table, things to keep doing, not things to change. It felt steadier that way. January came in cold and clear. I went back to the ceramics studio on the first Saturday, shaping clay with hands that now moved more surely. June told me I was getting better, and I believed her. I made another bowl, this one a little more even, but I kept a slight curve at the rim. One night, walking home from the store, I saw David's car parked in front of my house. My pulse jumped before my mind caught up. He was sitting inside, engine running, headlights throwing light across the snow. For a second, I considered walking past, pretending not to see him. But I didn't. I walked up to the driver's side and tapped on the window. He rolled it down, his breath visible in the cold air. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" I stood there, my grocery bag growing heavier in my hand. "Now?" "Yeah. If you have a minute." I thought about telling him no. About walking away. But something in his face, tired, maybe, made me nod. "Come inside. It's freezing." We sat at the kitchen table. I set the groceries on the counter without unpacking them. David looked around like he was seeing the house for the first time. "I've been meaning to come by," he started. I just didn't know how. I didn't rush to fill the silence. He rubbed his hands together. "Thanksgiving, Jenna and I, we thought it would be easier to keep it small this year. Things have been tense. And I guess I thought," he trailed off. "You thought I didn't belong in small," I said. His eyes flicked to mine, then away. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said evenly. "And you didn't tell me why." "You still haven't." He hesitated. Jenna felt like, "You've been distant. Like you don't really want to be part of things anymore." I felt a short, sharp laugh escape me. "So you tested that theory by not inviting me?" His face tightened. "I don't know. We handled it badly." I let his words hang there. I realized I didn't need to press for more. I already knew what I needed, that it had been a choice, not an accident, and that their reasoning, whatever it was about them, not me. "I'm not asking to be invited to anything," I said finally. "I just wanted you to understand that just family was a knife. And it landed where you aimed it." David nodded slowly. "I hear you." I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't know if I did. But I felt something shift, the difference between a door being locked and a door you can choose not to walk through. When he left, the kitchen felt the same as before, but I didn't. I unpacked my groceries, made tea, and sat with the sound of the kettle cooling. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and steady. I thought about the year ahead, not about whether David and I would find our way back to something like closeness, but about the bowls I'd make, the walks I'd take, the people I hadn't met yet who might one day sit at my table. The ache was still there, but it had thinned into something I could carry without effort. And for the first time, I saw clearly that my life wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to begin. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, the air softening, light stretching further each evening. My pothose sent out a new vine, curling toward the window. On a Tuesday, I baked bread and invited Mrs. Patel for tea. We laughed over crumbs, the dog asleep between us. I realized then that my table was full in ways that mattered. David hadn't called again, and I no longer waited for it. Some losses remain, but they stop steering you. As I opened the window to let in the crisp air, I knew this was my life, imperfect, mended, and entirely mine now.